Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Elisabeth Braw, who is a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, Elisabeth.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having found time for this conversation. And you recently published your analysis on Russia's shadow oil fleet, a tool of Russia's state to sell its oil worldwide, evading sanctions. But what is exactly this shadow fleet? Like, the name sounds pretty like from a Hollywood James Bond movie.
The Shadow Fleet is a collection of vessels that officially don't exist. So they exist in the flesh, so to speak, because if you're out and about on the world seas, you can see them, but they often change their ownership, and their owners are not your established shipping companies, the kinds of companies that ordinarily own ships. It's individuals that often, or newly established companies for the most part, that only own one or two vessels, and they hide in various locations. So it's very hard to track them down. So if you were to try to trace the ownership of a particular shadow vessel, you would most likely end up with an address somewhere in the remote location of India, or a post office address in the UAE, and it would be an entity you've never heard of. They've only got one ship listed to their names, and you can't find out who's behind it. And I've traced ships to addresses in India where there is no habitation. So it's clearly not a shipping company operating there. So that's the first part. The second part is that they often change flag registration, not just once, but several times. So the world's vessels, merchant vessels, indeed all vessels, need to be registered somewhere. And traditionally they were registered in the countries in which they were owned. Then we got, a few decades ago, we got flags of convenience. So Panama, the Marshall Islands, Liberia primarily, a lot of vessels, in fact, more than anywhere else, a lot of vessels are registered in these flag of convenience countries. But the shadow vessels are increasingly registered in really dodgy flag of convenience countries. So we are not talking about the Marshall Islands, Panama, Liberia. We are talking about countries like Gabon, like Eswatini, that have no history of maritime activity, and in many cases are landlocked. And so they are just a convenient flag for these vessels. You need a flag, and what better flag to get than one that asks no questions about your ownership or activities or anything like that. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that they often turn off their AIS, which is the identification system that all merchant vessels are required to have on, so that other vessels can see it. And the problem for the shadow fleet is that it's not just other vessels that see shadow vessels if they have their AIS turned on and functioning correctly. It's people like me who are trying to track the vessels, so they turn them off so as not to be seen by authorities, not to be seen by analysts, and the result is that they are also not seen by other ships. So that increases the risk of accidents. And then the fourth thing is that the nature of their business is primarily to transport Russian oil from Russia, often from the Baltic seaports of Russia, to their eventual destinations, which means that they travel through the waters of a lot of NATO member states and other countries that, as a result, face significant risk to their waters because, and this is the final thing, these vessels are very old, they are rickety, poorly maintained because they don't undergo regular maintenance. And so you can risk having a massive or even smaller oil spills in your waters, and there's nothing you can do because, and a very final thing about these vessels is they don't have proper insurance, they don't have Western insurance, so nobody is going to pay if they have an accident.
Wow, that sounds absolutely scary. You have practically named all the issues I wanted to address, so we will go deeper into each of these details. But before we go there, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you will not miss interviews like that. And we are talking about Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers. We're talking with Elisabeth Braw, who is a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. You have already mentioned like all these aspects, strange owners, in most cases very hard to find who stays behind the company, bad technical maintenance, no insurance or insufficient insurance, and all this looks pretty bad. But is it legal? Like when I have a transport on land and I want to come with a truck to another country, I need to have all papers. My truck needs to be maintained. I need to have papers from the country from where I come. I need to have insurance, etc. And it is what is requested for crossing a border. Uh, is the naval transport regulated by different rules? Is it possible just to say, okay, this ship will transport oil, not a big deal?
In theory and also in practice, what they are doing is violates lots of maritime rules. So international maritime rules require that you have proper insurance that will pay if you have an accident or other incident, and that insurance is primarily the Western insurance that is based in London. So you need that. And that's what international maritime rules say. They also say you have to use AIS, and that is something that applies to vessels from every country, flagged in every country. International maritime rules also put obligations on flag states. It's not just a matter of just letting a vessel have your flag. If you are the flag state, you have to conduct certain inspections and so forth. And the other thing that's important to remember that the constables of the International Maritime Order are the ports. So they are supposed to conduct all kinds of inspections of documentation, of seaworthiness, and so forth when the vessel calls at that respective port. It's a brilliant system because they all vessels have all have to call at ports, right? So that's where the inspection and assessment of seaworthiness takes place. But what do you do if vessels violate these rules? So let's say you are pretty certain as the international community that vessels don't have the proper documentation, that the flag states haven't done the inspections they're supposed to do, etc. Well, who's going to enforce those rules? There is the International Maritime Organization. There is something called the Paris Memorandum of Understanding. These are intergovernmental organizations, which means that they don't really have any executive power. So they can't go around and say, you have to do this, you have to do that, otherwise there will be sanctions. And then there is another thing, Sergej, which really is what makes this so frustrating and frankly maddening. It is that these vessels don't call at regular ports where they would be inspected. They sail from Russian ports to their destinations, primarily in India and China. And there's nobody who can go to India and China and say to the port authorities, well, have you done your work properly? And we don't think that you are assessing and inspecting the way you should do. So this is, I think, in a sense, the limitations of what we're seeing are the limitations of multilateral cooperation. The maritime sector works so well because it's everybody's interest that it works. Every country depends on shipping, but now one country in particular, Russia, and some other countries, China and India in particular, have decided that it's not a big deal if you subvert maritime rules, and as a result, there's nobody there who can be the police officer who comes and says, "Well, you have broken the rules. Now you'll be arrested." There is no such thing, so it just keeps happening.
And what you described looks like this system has been at least inspired by Russian authorities. So I cannot imagine that some business person in India would come to the idea, okay, I buy like one or two rusty tankers and Russia will accept them. No, it looks like Russia has started this system and inspired these business persons to start their businesses. Is it in the case?
So the shadow vessels have been around for some time. So they were not invented by Russia. And in fact, when this first started becoming noticeable was because Latin American drug gangs were using shadow vessels to transport their drugs. Then Iran started using shadow vessels, Venezuela. But when Russia joined this this activity, that's when it had its quantum leap. So it used to be, a few dozen shadow vessels, and that the world could handle. But when it grew to several hundred, that's when it becomes a real problem. And that's where we are today. There are different estimates because, of course, these are shadow vessels that are by definition hard to trace. But there are estimates between 1,400 now up to 1,800. That's a very significant number of vessels. And even though Russia didn't invent this system, it did spot an opportunity. And I think, Sergej, 20 years ago, Russia would have said, well, that's something for Latin American drug gangs. It's not what a respectable country does. But now, this is where we are.
And what is the volume of the oil which has been transferred by these vessels? Are most of these vessels now transporting Russia's oil, or is it just one of many markets worldwide?
So the main activity of the shadow fleet today is transporting Russian oil above the price cap. So that's what they are there for. There are other shadow vessels as well. There are cargo vessels or chemical tankers, but primarily they are oil tankers, crude oil tankers. And what's interesting also, I think, is that some of the vessels that people like me and maritime analysts have been able to trace, they used to transport oil on behalf of Iran, but now they clearly see a better business transporting oil on behalf of Russia. So there is no such thing as loyalty within this group. These shadow vessels go where there's money to be made, and at the moment that means that most of them are transporting Russian oil out of the country and onto destinations that are primarily Russia and China. But the point is also that anybody who is willing to buy Russian oil without looking too closely at where it came from or under what conditions it was transported, anybody can buy that oil right above the price cap. And again, nobody is there. Nobody has the authority to say no, you're not allowed to buy it.
But that is what is not quite understandable for me at that moment. You have mentioned that they mostly buy this oil from the Baltic Sea ports of Russia. And to exit Baltic Sea, you need to pass territorial waters of a couple of NATO countries, including Denmark, Sweden, etc. Of course, like the safe passage is a right which any ship enjoys, but you can be controlled. Is it possible to just pass through the straits of Denmark and saying, okay, like I'm just going on my business, my papers are okay, I'm not transporting illegal oil? Why doesn't control work there? Is there any control?
The problem is that Denmark and Sweden and Finland and all the other countries in the Baltic Sea are law-abiding countries. And so for a country like Denmark, where lots of the shadow vessels sail through. So if I think your readers can visualize the map, to get out of the Baltic Sea into the North Sea, you have to travel through the Great Belt of Denmark, or otherwise through the very narrow waters between Sweden and Denmark. So you have to essentially go through Danish or Swedish waters. And these are two law-abiding countries, so they are not going to say, well, we'll stop vessels that we think are Russian shadow vessels. And by the way, I should add that the Great Belt is considered an international passageway, so it's not considered Danish territorial waters, which complicates the fact further. But Denmark administers it, and so you could say under that... in that capacity, Denmark could inspect every vessel that I think is a shadow vessel, because it has the right to make sure that vessels passing through Danish waters have fulfilled the requirements. But this is again why the shadow fleet is so clever, or why it's such a brilliant concept. If Denmark were to inspect every shadow vessel, the Danish Navy would do nothing but inspecting vessels all day, shadow vessels all day. The Danish Navy also fulfills the Coast Guard functions in Denmark. So the Danish Navy would be completely tied up conducting inspections. Well, that is not particularly good for Danish defense or for NATO. And and this is where we are today. And you can't just say, well, we'll block all ships sailing from Russia. That is violating international maritime rules. And then Russia could say, whoa, that's a declaration of war because they are stopping all our vessels, and that is a violation of international maritime rules. And then Russia could escalate. And it is so incredibly maddening, this situation, because we all know that these vessels are up to no good, that they can cause environmental harm, that they can collide with other vessels, and yet we can't just block them.
Well, that looks first like a DDoS attack on the maritime security, and at the same time as a total inappropriate use of international law, like finding a loophole and making it larger, and at the same time neglecting other obligations. We are talking to Elisabeth Braw, who is a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. And you have authored a book which is called Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World. And what you describe here in your interview is something like a return to a wild era of pirates, corsairs, and all the time when there was no law in the seas, that every single investor, private investor, could buy a vessel and do whatever they wanted until they got caught and hanged. What happened by the chance? Does it mean that this policy, which Russia and you say China try to implement now, neglecting international law and violating it deliberately, does it mean that the globalization rules which shaped our global economy do not work anymore, or do not always work?
They definitely don't always work. And Sergey, why I think this is so concerning is that the only way modern economies can function is if shipping functions. And if you have a critical mass of vessels that violate the rules of international shipping and the international maritime rules more widely, then it makes it unsafe for legally operating vessels to sail in the same waters. And also other shipping companies will say, well, hang on, why is it that we have hundreds of vessels that follow no rules? Why are they allowed to be in the same waters while I follow the rules at great expense? I get proper insurance, and I do everything by the book. And so I think, or what I worry is that we'll have more ship owners sell their vessels to the shadow fleet because they say, well, I might as well get money out of it. And by the way, you get a lot of money if you sell your vessel to the shadow fleet because the shadow fleet needs more vessels. And so I worry that we'll get more ship owners selling their vessels to the shadow fleet. The shadow fleet will grow further, and it will become an even more sort of erosive atmosphere for legally operating shipping companies. But the fundamental problem here is really that you can get away with violating rules whether you're a country or a shipping company. And the other side can't say, well, in that case, I'm going to violate rules too, and I'm going to punish you, because then the rules-based international order crumbles, and the country against whom we take action will then escalate. So it is really a dilemma being stuck in this, or being a law-abiding country, or indeed a law-abiding shipping company is a dilemma, and that's where we are today. So when people say, oh, we should just block all Russian ships from Russian-linked ships from the Baltic Sea. Well, it is. That would be incredibly dangerous, because we could be certain that Russia would retaliate massively if we were to do that. Not least because they're getting so much money out of this oil trade.
How can Russia retaliate? They don't control any international water passage.
No, but they can retaliate in the Baltic Sea by targeting, for example, NATO vessels in the Baltic Sea, or by increasing their GPS jamming, for example. There's any number of measures they could take, both in the traditional military domain and in the grey zone. And we've already seen them try out various measures in the grey zone. we haven't attributed, or governments haven't attributed the recent GPS jamming in the Baltic Sea region to Russia, but it seems clear that Russia is behind it. So that's just to say, Russia can be traditional in its response and use military means, or it can be creative and use non-military means.
And what can be a plausible answer to that challenge that we are clearly observing now? You have demonstrated perfectly the erosion, massive erosion of international maritime law and usage of unconventional means to violate security order in Europe and worldwide. And if you don't stop it, the hole will just get bigger and other will follow, as you have also described. How can we stop it? With what means? If you say the Danish fleet cannot do their job because they are not numerous enough, can other nations, for example, France or the United Kingdom or the US, come for assistance?
Well, I suppose one could propose an international Coast Guard alliance that would inspect all vessels going into Danish Strait, something like that. And that would really be a very novel thing to do for the countries that were to be part of it, because it is sort of a military action, even though Coast Guards they are not military, but it would be a government action against grey zone aggression, targeting or harming a particular country. I think there is scope, definitely scope for such collaboration, because if we let this continue, then others will conclude. Well, first of all, the current shadow operators will conclude that it's safe to continue breaking maritime rules, and other dubious operators, countries and shipping companies would conclude that they should do the same. So something like that, definitely. But I think, Sergej, that an even more immediate step that could be taken is for open source investigators out there, both those working professionally and those doing it as a hobby. They should try to identify as many of these owners of shadow vessels as possible, because it is such painstaking work. I used to work in corporate intelligence, and back then I used to think that all roads lead to the British Virgin Islands, which is where companies like to hide money. Well, in the case of the shadow fleet, all roads lead to India, Turkey, and the UAE. And I think we need as many open source types as possible to just trace all these owners, these tiny operators who we don't really know who they are, to trace them and out them, because they want to hide in the shadows. Well, they don't have the right to hide in the shadows. Let's out them so that they get to disincentivize them from being part of this trade, and also to send a message to others who may want to buy an old vessel from an established company and essentially take it dark and make money on Russian oil, so that they realize that their reputation is at stake if they do that.
And do we have any example from the past of similar actions, joint actions by the state to bring order to an area where international law is under attack?
So what we have seen a lot over the years is the US Navy and the Royal Navy, to a lesser extent, they've conducted freedom of navigation operations. So they often sail through, especially the US Navy, often sail through congested waters in the South China Sea. And they have even done similar journeys through the Strait of Hormuz. So we have seen things like that in the past, but freedom of navigation operations are not really applicable to the shadow fleet, because they're not sort of staking out some sort of hold on the territory. They're just sailing where they shouldn't be sailing. So that wouldn't work. But it is the case that the US, which is the world's sort of de facto protector of the global maritime order, tries to intervene on a regular basis when a country subverts maritime rules. But it is also the case that the US, even if it's backed up by other countries, doesn't have enough capacity to tackle every single violation there is today of maritime rules, because there are so many. The Shadow Fleet is just one area of activity. So it's definitely the case that the US could team up with the US Coast Guard could team up with other Coast Guards and perhaps conduct an exercise in Danish waters, something like that. And then, if I could just add one more thing, sometimes, every now and then, occasionally, we see somebody pop up with a brilliant idea, somebody who doesn't work for a government and is not, any sort of notable analyst. And we saw that a couple of years ago when the Russian Navy was going to conduct an exercise off the coast of Ireland, and the Irish government pleaded with Russia not to conduct this exercise. And of course, the Russians didn't listen. So then in stepped Irish fishermen. The Irish Fishermen's Association said, we're not going to let this happen because we depend on these waters for our livelihoods. So what they did was they sailed out there, as they always do, but they took turns. So there were always around the clock. The waters were full of Irish fishing boats, which meant that the Russian Navy would have struggled to conduct this exercise because naval vessels are only allowed to be at a certain distance from civilian vessels. And these Irish fishermen, whom nobody had asked to help, they came up with this brilliant idea, and Russia had to abandon this exercise. So that is an illustration of how good ideas can come from unexpected quarters. So let's hope many of your listeners and viewers feel called to submit ideas for how to deter the Shadow Fleet without causing escalation.
That is exactly a brilliant example how a civilian fleet of a neutral country, not even a NATO member, has defeated Russia's navy in international waters. And that is, of course, an inspiring story. But our international law and rule of law and security order is under attack. It is getting eroded, and we need to find solutions as soon as possible to prevent it from being destroyed and prevent the dangers to arise in front of our eyes. We have talked to Elisabeth Braw, who is a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, who is an expert in global trade, Shadow Fleet, Russia's Shadow Fleet, and author of the book Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World. Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for this interview.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. And if you think that someone needs to listen to this interview and to this insight by Elisabeth Braw, feel free to send this link to this person and wait for the next interviews.